Hello, everyone, and welcome to Environmental Justice is Racial Justice. Faith Communities Respond. I'm Betsy Sowers. My pronouns are she and her. I co-chair the Alliance of Baptist Creation Justice Community. I am Minister for Earth Justice at Old Cambridge Baptist Church in Cambridge, Mass., resident of a frontline community, and your moderator for today's webinar. As folks are joining, I invite you to introduce yourself in the chat with the name of your faith community, if any, and the tribal land upon which it is located, if you know it. And as you're doing that, I want to introduce our language interpreters, Marina Martinez, who will get our Spanish-speaking participants on board, followed by Karen Sofia Neto Seferina, who will assist our Portuguese speakers. Marina.
Good morning, buenos días. Para acceder a la interpretación en español, busque el icono en la parte inferior de su pantalla que aparecerá dentro de un momentito, que es en forma de globo. Hágale clic al globo y elija español. También es recomendable apagar el audio principal para escuchar bien la traducción. Gracias. Thank you.
Okay, Karen.
Olá, boa tarde. Sejam bem-vindos ao Justiça Ambiental e Justiça Racial, Comunidades de Fé Respondem. Para ouvir a interpretação em português, vai aparecer um globo na barra de baixo do Zoom. Você pode escolher português e aí você vai ouvir a minha interpretação em português. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Marina and Karen, for making this webinar accessible to our Spanish and Portuguese speakers. Closed captions are also available for anyone with a hearing impairment. And now I welcome Helen Smith from our co-sponsor and platform host.
Dou boas-vindas a Helen Smith, nossa co-patrocinadora e anfitriã da plataforma. Criação de Ministérios por Justiça.
Oops, Karen, we're hearing you over the English.
I'm sorry, so the interpretation feature has not been started yet.
Okay.
So whoever's the host needs to start that, please.
Tell me when we're ready.
Sorry, just a little issue here. Okay, we should be good.
No, that didn't work. I'm still, I'm not an interpreter. I'm like a participant, and I imagine that Karen is the same.
Okay. Okay, so I see Karen as how about now? Okay. I think we're all good with our translation.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much.
Absolutely.
Now Helen Smith is going to come from our co-sponsor and platform host, Creation Justice Ministries, to help be sure that everyone is on board with other technical matters.
Absolutely. Thank you, Betsy. And thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Helen Smith, and I'm with Creation Justice Ministries. It's a gift to be co-sponsoring this important event. Thank you to the Alliance of Baptists for all your leadership and vision for this program. And a special thank you to Betsy Sowers for all of your hard work pulling this event together. Creation Justice Ministries brings together 38 Christian denominations and communions to equip, educate, and mobilize Christian individuals, congregations, denominations, and communions to protect, restore, and rightly share God's creation. We work on a number of environmental and climate issues, ranging from ocean to public lands, centering equity and justice in all that we do. I want to give a couple of quick tech instructions, and then we should be good to go with our program. First, at the bottom of your screen, you should see a little CC box with live transcript. You should be able to click on that to have closed captions come up. There's also a globe that says interpretation below it. As the interpreters have said, you can click on that globe and select either Spanish, Portuguese, or English so that you can hear in your preferred language. We have a Q&A function. You will also see at the bottom of your screen. That is where we would like you to put all of your questions so that things don't get lost in the chat. Obviously, we are all here to learn and fellowship together, and we appreciate each of us respecting each other. And I think that covers everything. Thank you so much for attending our program.
Thank you, Helen, and Kathy McGoy, also from the Alliance of Baptists, for taking care of our tech. To Catherine Smith, Executive Director of the Baptist Creation Care Initiative, and Reverend Sarah Macias, Co-Chair of the Alliance of Baptist Creation Justice Community, for curating our Q&A. Special thanks to our primary sponsor, the Alliance of Baptists, a movement within the larger Baptist community knit together by love for one another and for God, combining progressive inquiry, contemplative prayer, and prophetic action to bring about justice and healing in a changing world. Thanks also to our co-sponsors, Creation Justice Ministries, the American Baptist Creation Justice Network, Environmental Ministries of the United Church of Christ, the Southern New England Conference UCC Environmental Ministries Team, Mass Interfaith Power and Light, UU Mass Action, and the Jewish Climate Action Network, Massachusetts. This event is also endorsed by Churches That Thrive for Racial Justice. Now, I invite you to center yourselves in this space and in this virtual space. Take a moment for our land acknowledgement. And I invite you to scroll through the introductions in the chat that are coming in and be amazed and convicted by the wide diversity of tribal lands represented here. We acknowledge and honor our Indigenous neighbors whose ancestors were tending every part of creation we now occupy long before our time, and who are still here, reminding us that we can never own the land and offering us examples of how to enter into healthy relationships with the earth and each other. We acknowledge that connecting environmental justice and racial justice includes a commitment to justice for our Indigenous peoples and their lands. And now I welcome Reverend Tom Carr, a member of the steering committee of our co-sponsor, the American Baptist Creation Justice Network, to lead us in an opening prayer.
In whatever way is your way, let us join together as one in prayer. Soul within our souls, life within all life. We call you by many names and no name. We come acknowledging with deep thanksgiving that all things are born of you. Within each one of us, we carry your light and your love. Within each one of us, we hold our hopes and dreams in our very life. May we recognize your presence in this moment. And so open the eyes of our hearts to see you moving in the desperately needed work of justice for those who have been marginalized and excluded, those who suffer and are wounded by our very way of life. May we unstop the ears of our minds and souls to hear the cries of your creation, calling us to remember our oneness with all of life. And so lead us to reciprocity, healing, and true reconciliation. And so may this time together be one of blessing. Blessing for those who lead us in this webinar. Blessing for those of us who receive whatever wisdom, knowledge, and passion might arise. and blessing for those who will gather whatever fruits may grow from this time, because we have been here together as one in faith, hope, and love. Amen.
Amen, and thank you, Tom. The Alliance of Baptists and many of the other faith communities here today are engaged in initiatives to address white supremacy in our histories, our present-day communities, and our personal lives, and to move toward becoming intentionally anti-racist. Some of us via the Churches That Thrive for Racial Justice initiative. Many of our majority white communities and individuals practice creation care and even creation justice, and yet aren't always aware that environmental justice is not just a synonym for creation justice, but that space where creation justice and racial and economic justice overlap. Communities of color and low wealth too often live in that space. So it's my pleasure to introduce a panel of environmental justice leaders to help us explore that space and to invite faith communities and people of goodwill to act for both racial and climate justice, because we will not solve one without the other. Hop Hopkins, Director of Organizational Transformation for the Sierra Club, says it best: you can't have climate change without sacrifice zones, and you can't have sacrifice zones without disposable people, and you can't have disposable people without racism. So let me now introduce our speakers, and we'll drop some links to their websites into the chat so you can see so much more about each of these amazing people than we have time to share right now. First, Dr. Robert Bullard is Distinguished Professor of Urban Planning and Founding Director of the Bullard Center for Environmental and Climate Justice at Texas Southern University. Professor Bullard is often called the father of environmental justice. He is the author of 18 books and co-founder of the HBCU Climate Change Consortium. In 2020, the United Nations Environment Program honored him with its Champions of the Earth Lifetime Achievement Award. In 2021, President Biden appointed him to serve on the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. And in 2022, he was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. And Dr. Bullard was raised in a Baptist faith community. Reverend Mariama White-Hammond is an advocate for ecological and social justice, youth engagement, and spirit-filled organizing. She is the founding pastor of New Roots AME Church in Dorchester, Massachusetts. She's with us in her capacity as a faith leader, but she also serves as Chief of Environment, Energy, and Open Space for the City of Boston, where she is responsible for leading the mission of enhancing environmental justice and quality of life in the city. Reverend Mariama uses an intersectional lens in both her faith-based and secular ecological work, and as the former director of Project Hip Hop, she also uses the arts as a tool to raise awareness for social issues. And we thank Reverend Mariama especially for being here in the midst of dealing with COVID, and pleased that this is a remote event where she is able to do so. Reverend Dr. Deborah Conrad is pastor of Parkview Congregational Church, Aurora, Colorado, and was the pastor of People's Church, an Alliance of Baptist ABC congregation in Flint, Michigan, during the height of the lead-contaminated water crisis. She was there a community leader, public witness, and pastoral caregiver during a time of catastrophic environmental injustice. She believes faith is deeply political and has spent her career advocating for her LGBTQ community and educating church folks about injustice in our country. She has written, led workshops, and preached about environmental, economic, and racial justice for Baptist and UCC publications and events. And you Alliance of Baptist folks who are here today will remember powerful sermons by both Reverend Mariama and Pastor Deb at our 2018 annual gathering, Earth Beloved Community. As our speakers are presenting, please do remember to put your questions into the Q&A and not the chat. And now join me in welcoming our first presenter, Dr. Robert Bullard.
Good afternoon. It is a pleasure to be with you today. I'm a bit jet lagged. I flew in from Johannesburg, and so a 15-hour flight back to Houston. But I'm here. Let me share screen. First, I think it's important that we understand the issues that I'm dealing with are real and they are urgent. The quest for environmental and climate justice, my job is to connect the dots in 15 minutes. And I've been doing this for many decades, 40 plus years. And the 15 books that you see cover a range of issues from housing, transportation, environment, issues around health, planning, smart growth, food and water security, disaster response. It's 18 books, but it's just one book, but don't tell anybody. It looks at the connection between where we live, work, play, worship, go to school, as well as the physical and natural world. America is segregated, and so is pollution. And we look at why is it that some communities get more than their fair share of things that other people don't want. And if we can go back 100 years plus and look at a public policy of redlining has created lots of disparities and inequities. As I said, I was drafted into this area 43 years ago when Linda McKeever Bullard, my wife at the time, asked me to do a study, a report for a lawsuit that she filed, Beam versus Southwestern Waste Management Corporation. She filed that lawsuit on December 21st, 1979, on my 33rd birthday. That was my present. And so she sued the city of Houston, Harris County, and the state of Texas for planning to permit a landfill in the middle of a predominantly Black middle-class community, not a poverty, not a ghetto, but a middle-class neighborhood of homeowners. I did the study, and what we found is from the 1930s up to 1978, 82% of all the waste, garbage disposed in Houston was disposed in predominantly Black neighborhoods, even though Blacks made up only 25% of the population. There was no environmental justice movement in 1979. That movement was born in Warren County in 1982, some 3 years after we did our study and the lawsuit was filed in Houston. And again, this was over waste dumping. And this was toxic waste dumped in a rural, predominantly Black county. No, this is not Black Lives Matter. Yes, it is Black Lives Matter in 1982. Over 500 people were arrested, went to jail. Dr. Benjamin Chavis, who was with United Church of Christ, Commission for Racial Justice, led that struggle. And the term environmental racism was coined by Dr. Chavis. 1987, the Toxic Waste and Race Study was the first national study to look at the connection between race and national study between waste and waste. And that study found that race was the most potent variable predicting where these facilities are located. I wrote a book in 1990 called Dumping in Dixie, and again, made the connection between waste dumping and who gets the worst of the pollution. And this is 1990, Dumping in Dixie, Race, Class, and Environmental Quality. That iconic photograph in Warren County protest was such a image that I said, oh, that should be on a book. And I put that photograph on Dumping in Dixie. Climate change will exacerbate all of those disparities that have existed for many centuries and decades. Climate change will impact every region of the country. And we can see in this map, climate change is breaking out all over the map. I live in the Gulf Coast, and we're dealing with floods, hurricanes, winter storms. And you can see there's no region of the country that will be spared. However, climate change will hit the poorest region and the poorest people hardest. If we do nothing or do little, the US could lose a 1.2% drop in its GDP and economic prosperity. But the poorest region of the country could lose up to a 20% drop in GDP. And we know the poorest part of the country happens to be the southern half of the US. If we talk about which communities will hit the hardest, EPA's 2021 study showed that, again, people of color will get hit the hardest when we talk about heat waves, poor air quality, floodings, storms, etc. And so climate change will hit every part of the country, but it'll hit those most vulnerable, low income and people of color and communities that are living on the fence line and in the flood zone the hardest. Even there's racism in the way that we distribute our federal funds for disaster. If you look at the $10 billion above severe weather events and disasters, when federal money goes in, it tends to make white communities wealthier and people of color communities poorer. On average, white communities end up $126,000 in wealth increase, whereas people of color communities on average lose $29,000. Climate change is also a health threat, and those communities that are already experiencing disparities will experience greater disparities in health. Climate change is not just a physical health issue, it's a mental health threat. The threat of not knowing what disasters will hit and not knowing the impact, whether or not your kids have to be evacuated out of a school that's flooding or you be evacuated off a rooftop. And so climate change is a mental health issue. It's in some cases, if places that have been hit over and over again, a lot of the residents suffer from what's tantamount to PTSD. The mental stress is unhealthy. When we talk about the question, will the government response to climate change be fair? Colleague and I wrote a book in 2012 called The Wrong Complexion for Protection, How the Government Response to Disaster Endangers African-American Communities. 300 pages, we basically surmised those 300 pages, and that answers that question. No, the government will not respond to climate change in a fair way unless we somehow fight to make it operate in a fair, just way. Even FEMA's own report indicates that the resources, the climate just recovery dollars is not reaching the most vulnerable. Communities of color and poor communities are getting left behind in managed buyouts, in managed retreats. And you look at 40,000 properties in voluntary buyouts. Again, those properties are more likely to be properties in communities that are more affluent and are more likely to be occupied by a higher percentage of whites. If you look at the FEMA buyouts, again, on average, 85% of those buyouts are in neighborhoods that are white, very white, whereas Black and Hispanic neighborhoods are oftentimes left behind in flood zone and to suffer for a lack of getting the recovery dollars and the kinds of rebuilding infrastructure. All communities in the U.S. are not created equal. And I said before, redlining has heightened vulnerability. And redlining is tied to greater flooding. Neighborhoods that were redlined 100 years ago are more prone to flooding today. And again, so when we talk about redlining, disproportionately impacting people of color. Going forward in the next 30 years, flood risk will disproportionately impact people of color, and especially Black communities that communities that have a disproportionate large share of Black communities. In the next 30 years, we expect to see flood risk increase by 25%. Well, for communities that have a larger percentage of Black people, that percent is of flood risk is 40%. And if you see this map, the darker the blue, the greater the flood risk and the flood damage. If you look at the states, you can see the dark shaded areas represent high percentage of communities that will see their insurance policies, flood policies increase. In the state where I live, in the next 30 years, Texas will see the greatest flood risk, 86% increase in flood premiums. When we talk about climate change impacting 60% of the Superfund sites, and if you look at who lives near a Superfund site, people of color. Superfund sites are disproportionately located where people of color and near low-income housing. If you live near a Superfund site, your life expectancy is lowered. Redlining will increase not just flooding, but pollution and air quality, diminished air quality. People of color already breathe more than their fair share of other people's pollution. And so when we talk about having the wrong complexion for protection, living around refineries and living around facilities that create lots of pollution, drilling, whether it's oil, wells, fracking, we're talking about the burden of pollution. And by being so dependent on fossil fuels and the impact of fossil fuels on climate and the greenhouse gases. So we're talking about having solutions that move beyond just greenhouse gases, but co-pollutants that create problems for low-income housing residents who live next to these dangerous facilities. We talk about high and elevated asthma rates. Black children have an asthma death rate that's 8 times that of non-Hispanic white children. Climate change will exacerbate those disparities in terms of urban heat islands, not having trees, green canopy, and looking at the fact that rich Americans enjoy more green space and trees than poor. People of color, 74% of people of color live in what's called nature-deprived areas. This is today, compared to 23% of whites. Climate change will exacerbate those disparities when we talk about land cover and green canopy in terms of trees. Trees are good for not just having shade and cooler, but also nature. When we talk about vulnerability and heat stress, climate change will make it hotter, and hotter days mean more emergency room visits. Heat and pollution means more bad pregnancy outcomes, disproportionately impacting Black women and women of color. Hotter days also mean hotter schools, and schools that don't have the infrastructure for HVACs will mean lower achievement. Hotter days will mean more outdoor workers having heat stroke, loss of income. Heat also droughts, more wildfires, more smoke, and children, vulnerability. We're talking about power outages and heat. We're talking when people who are on electrical devices that need medical devices that need electricity. We're talking about elevated health disparities and death. And again, we already have energy insecurity disproportionately impacting poor people. It's a map that shows you the darker the area, the greater the energy insecurity. The administration has a Justice 40 initiative that talks about, as we move to a clean energy economy, 40% of those benefits will be directed toward disadvantaged environmental justice communities. I serve on the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, and we've been pushing for initiatives that deal with the converging threats, environmental, climate, health, justice issues. These are the same issues that drive climate change, that push us to the edge when it comes to this existential threat, are the same forces that drive voter suppression and not getting adequate health care and expanding Medicaid to states and poor people. We're getting there, and I think we're getting more young people. And our job as educators and as leaders, whether in the faith community or in universities, we are coming together, and I think this is great. This is a great time to work on justice issues all around. And I think that this workshop is very timely, and I'm glad that I was able to participate. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bullard. And to say before I went into the ministry, I was a flight attendant, international flight attendant, and I am just amazed that you are coherent and able to do that whole presentation while so seriously jet lagged, and really appreciate you taking the time to be with us. And are you able to stay the whole time today, or are you going to have to leave us early?
I'm going to have to leave you early. I can stay part of the time, but I
Okay.
do have to leave. I have another. They have me back to back. I'm sorry.
Yes, that's what I had heard. So I've built in a little, instead of holding all of the Q&A to the end, I want to take just a few minutes now, since you may not be with us for the whole time, to bring in Reverend Mariama and Pastor Deb for just a few minutes of conversation, and then see if we can get to any questions that may be in the chat for you. My first question would be, in terms of all these folks who are here from faith communities who may or may not have connected the dots yet, what would your perhaps top desire be of what you would want to say to them about how to get their communities engaged? And part B of that question is, and maybe for all three of you, is about the role of Black, Indigenous, and people of color in leadership in their own communities, and the role of those of us who are in predominantly white faith communities who would like to be allies in an effective and respectful way.
That question for me?
But yeah, I think it's for you, and then I'd like to hear from the other two, and then we'll maybe open it up.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's important that those on the call understand that the environmental justice movement, as it emerged as a national movement, emerged with leadership from the faith community, and out of the African American faith tradition, that like the Commission for Racial Justice was based, a Black civil rights organization based in the United Church of Christ, and the fact that bringing us together of many faiths and many sectors, civil rights, universities, young people, and issues around economic justice with labor, we're able to bring together this idea that those who are concerned about justice, there's no bounds as to who can join under this big tent. And what we've been able to do is to those 17 principles of environmental justice that we developed at the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit, those principles were developed 30 years ago, but they're just as relevant today. Those who are most impacted must speak for themselves, and that those who are on the front line of injustice, no matter what the injustice is, need to be in those rooms when decisions are being made about their self-determination. And I think the church, it was the meeting place for a lot of our early meetings in this not just the civil rights movement, but even in the early meetings of our environmental justice movement, because many of our communities did not have environmental organizations that had centers and buildings and spaces. And so we met at the church. And the different congregations and denominations, a lot of times we left those at the door, and we came in to work on justice. And I think we've remained that way along, and we've always been multiracial and multi-sectoral. And we've always said that if I'm in the room and there's no indigenous person or Asian Pacific Islander or Latino or Hispanic in the room, I will not speak for them, but I will raise my voice that this room is not diverse, and that there are issues that cut across our issues. I'm not speaking for them or speaking for that group, but I am saying that these are issues that resonate across, and we've maintained that. At the COP27 meeting, climate meeting in Egypt, in the next couple of weeks, there are a group of us that have organized the first climate justice pavilion that will be on the blue side, on the government side. There's been 26 climate meetings. We've never had a climate justice pavilion. And the Bullard Center, the Deep South Center in New Orleans, and WEAC in New York, our 3 Black-led organizations, all of us graduated from HBCUs, and we understand the foundations. We have organized, we raised the money to have that pavilion, and that pavilion will be the magnet for attracting those who are concerned about climate justice, economic justice, racial justice, global justice, for the global South, and for those who want to change, who really want climate change.
Excellent, thanks. Pastor Deb or Reverend Mariama?
So I think I would add to that. I mean, I think to Dr. Bullard's point, the role of the church being so intimately tied to the environmental justice movement, for people to recognize that engagement with this issue is part of the church's legacy. And I think this is not part of what I'll talk about, but I think on the other side of things, I feel like in many ways, the church as an institution is on life support and has lost its relevance. And so I think this is an opportunity to feed 2 birds with 1 stone in making sure that we provide more support to this critical issue. And it's an opportunity to reinvigorate the church at the same time, because young people are not coming to church, but they are in climate justice work and are concerned about what is happening in the world. So I think we should not come sort of trying to tell people what to do. I think we need to come with a level of humility, but I think it is an amazing Holy Spirit drenched opportunity to find new spirit and relevance for the church, and at the same time to bring another level of energy to the climate movement, particularly energy that might have some ability to move into some of our more conservative communities that have not always been as prominently at the table. So I think there's a real synergistic opportunity if the church were to engage more deeply.
And I want to lay that at the feet of the clergy. I think that pastors are scared. They're scared of losing their jobs. They're scared of, I don't know, losing the big giver. They're scared of, hell, I don't know what they're scared of, but they're scared. And so pastors are not, and I can only speak for white Christian church that I've experienced, but pastors are not speaking prophetically to the kinds of things that Dr. Bullard and Reverend Mariama are talking about, the kinds of things that we're here to discuss, plus broadly a whole lot of other things. And so when pastors are not laying out the vision, when preachers are not being prophetic and laying out a vision, people have nowhere to go. They don't know what the church stands for, what to do, or how the church can be more powerful than it is, or have any power at all in the circumstances that we face. We are, I don't think this is unrelated. We are in a time of growing fascism, authoritarianism, and the church has a role to play. The church has a voice. The people of faith, progressive people of faith, have something to say to that. And I think we need to say it. So I put it right at the feet of faith leaders.
Yes, let me just say, I have another PowerPoint where I have maps and that can overlay, and I can trace the 1820 compromise, a map where you had the compromise that was dividing up the power for slaves and 3/5, etc. And that map, footprint, fingerprint, going up to 2020, it's the same map in terms of where Black people are, and where voter suppression, where the lower life expectancy, the lower income, you start naming all those negative indicators in terms of quality of life, where it's harder, where they're passing voter suppression, it's harder to vote. I mean, so yes, I think the faith community has a lot to offer when it comes to the moral authority of the church and the whole idea of what it means to have the right to breathe clean air, drink clean water, and to have access to basic human rights like housing and safety. Those are things that I think the Christian church, you know, when I was going to Sunday school, and my mom, and we went all, I mean, she was a real Christian. She believed in all of those teachings. And I think somehow we've lost some of that. And I don't know, and just like you were saying, young people right now, they flock to our movement. They own the environment and climate justice issue, the racial justice issue as it relates to George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and the racial awakening. And I think the faith community having an awakening that comes back to that center of caring, of understanding and empathy and feeling. And that's something I think when you talk to a lot of young people, they're kind of agnostic. They're just like, well, what are they doing over there? 30,000, 50,000 big church. What are they doing? I mean, you know, I don't want to be overly critical, but I do know that there's an opportunity to seize this moment, because we're taught climate change is a threat to humanity, all of our humanity. And if we don't see it that way, and we send people up in space and to the moon, but they come back home, and this is home. This is Mother Earth, and so I feel passionate about this. And as I said, I've been doing this for 40-something years, and I see this as the quest for justice as a race, but it's not a sprint. It's more like a marathon relay. We know there's no such race, but you run your 26.2 miles, and then you pass the baton to that next generation, and you hope that it's a smooth pass off, because if you drop the baton, that you get a setback. So we have to mentor, we have to teach, train, and we have to really preach in a way that people can see that this is real and it's urgent.
Thank you so much, all three of you. I did drop into the chat while you were talking, Dr. Bullard, the link to the Leventhal Map Center at the Boston Public Library that you and I and Reverend Mariama are all featured in that exhibit.
Oh, is that?
Yeah. I've been there several times in person, but you can actually, those of you who aren't in the Boston area can go to the link and see the entire exhibit online. And it shows how you can see environmental justice in the maps. And it's just really stunning. It's interactive. I recommend it. And we need to move along so that we give time for our other two speakers. So thank you, Dr. Bullard, again, for making the time to be here for your amazing presentation. I always learn something new. I've seen you speak several times virtually, and your presence is really inspiring us to make renewed commitments. So thank you, and you're welcome to stay as long as you can.
Well, thank you very much.
And now join me in welcoming our next presenter, Reverend Mariama White-Hammond.
You're muted. Oh, Reverend Hammond, you're muted.
Sorry about that. So I was just saying a thank you to Reverend Betsy and also to Dr. Bullard for so many decades of amazing work. We're looking at this idea of climate justice, and I want to start by sort of putting a little bit of historical context, because I I think language can be really important in understanding what's going on and how we're moving. And I remember in hearing the term climate justice from the Climate Justice Alliance, a number of folks who connected to that, when it was sort of not a popularized term, right? When it was sort of a thing that folks were kicking around, some of the folks in New York that I knew and other folks were having this conversation about climate justice. And I remember in 2014, when there was the big march in New York City, I had unfortunately had a little accident. I tripped and I had a little bit of an issue with my hip, and my doctor told me, you will not be going to that march unless you're doing it in a wheelchair. And I thought it might be a little bit hard to get to New York and traverse it. So I remember I was watching it and watching my friends live tweet. And I remember it being a pretty exciting moment, mostly because it was the first time in my lifetime, or that I remember, where there was a large scale climate march or climate mobilization at which Indigenous people were at the front. People of color were at the front. And there was a clear recognition that unlike what has been the tradition of the conservation movement, a recognition that folk of color are the ones who often suffer first and hardest when we're talking about any kind of environmental injustice. And so I remember folks having those big banners that said climate justice now, and being so excited. I remember my husband and I were in Maine watching, and I'm trying to stream. And I remember when I got back, when folks got back, and I was preaching in a couple of different congregations, and suddenly everyone started saying, we're doing climate justice work. Except almost none of them had actually taken a moment to ask the question, where did the term come from? And what does it mean? Because climate justice itself is a term that comes from a critique of the way that the climate and conservation movement has formulated itself to this point. And I think that critique was lost on many, many of us. And so I'm glad we're having this conversation, because climate justice itself is about racial justice. But we've had to go back and lift that up and have some of the conversations that were not had at the time. So if people ask me what I do, I usually call my work ecological justice. And this is not a rejection of any other term. If you say I do environmental justice work, yep. If you say climate, all of that, yes. But ecological justice for me best frames how I see my work. And that's because from my perspective, the situation that we're in is not a scientific, but a spiritual problem. Now, I'm maybe being partially provocative, because it is also there's science to it. But at the end of the day, I believe that when you look at the science and technology that just dictates how we do what we do, spirituality dictates what we value and what we believe. And I believe that the situation that we're in is a problem of values and a problem of what we believe. And I would say that when I say this, right, people always push back on it, ask me questions about it. The people who almost never push back on it are scientists themselves, because they'll tell you, I've been giving people all the data, I've been studying, I've been producing reports, and somehow it still hasn't always made people make the necessary changes. We know what's happening and what's coming, and yet we don't change. And so why ecological justice? How do I frame this? And I would say ecology as a discipline means study of home. It comes from the Greek word eco, comes from the Greek word oikos, meaning home. And ecology as a discipline looks at systems and relationships. It says that you can't understand a frog by dissecting it and understanding it down to its cellular level. What you need to understand about that frog is what is the pond that it lives in, and what's the tree next to the pond that it lives in, whose leaves drop in and that draw water out of the pond. You have to understand where that frog lives and all the other relations with which it's connected. I believe the same is true about humans. that you cannot understand us without understanding with whom we are connected and the system of relationships that make it possible for us to live. You cannot understand us without understanding that the majority of our body is made of water. And yet we have created a way of being that allows pollution of the very source of life with the justification of our economy. Economy, from that same root, home, means management of home. And we have created a system of management of this only home that we have that is dysfunctional and unsustainable. And so when people say, oh, you know, this is about saving the planet, I say, actually, the planet is going to be okay. At the end of the day, she may be a little banged up and damaged, but at the end of the day, the question is, are we forcing the planet to choose between her survival and ours? Because if that is the case, she will choose herself over us, her dysfunctional children. I would say we live as a bunch of children, which from my own context, we say children with no home training. People who just do not know how to act. People who live in a home, go to the refrigerator, see somebody else's name clearly on the container and decide we're going to eat it anyway. People who go into the bathroom, leave a mess, don't even bother to flush, and certainly not even wipe up a little bit behind us. People who leave their clothes strewn all over the place, not even just in their room, but everybody else's. The reality is we live in such a way that the home itself is at risk of being unbearable. And from my perspective, that is a spiritual problem, a problem of our behavior and our values that's just completely untenable. And I think you are not surprised, and I think Dr. Bullard has connected this very well, to know that I don't think the way we live with the planet is the only sign of our disordered values. The way we act with each other is in ways that no other species behaves as this dysfunctionally over very, very minute, basically undetectable genetic differences. And so we've come to this moment where I think we recognize the impacts, the global, the beyond our previous understanding level of impact of the way we choose not to be in right relationship with each other, nor with all the other relations with whom we share this planet. And so for me, racism and environmental injustice are both roots of the same disordered values that we've allowed to become the heart of our society. And so before I continue in a theological direction, which I'm more than willing to do, I just want to tell two quick stories, and then we'll have some space to look differently, because I want to name how this plays out. There's sometimes where I think we can have these conversations, recognize it, but then we struggle to see how that shows up in real, tangible, lived ways in our own lives. And so I want to tell a story a little bit about my own journey around solar equity that sort of, I think, shows how those things play out and offer some suggestions for how we might do better. So like many states in the country, about 12 years ago, the state of Massachusetts got pretty engaged in offering solar subsidies to encourage more people to use solar in their homes, businesses, et cetera. And those subsidies were actually pretty generous. We were a little bit of a battle between us and New York and California, and who could do the best and who was going to get the most. And we were trying to outpace. But what happened is, as those subsidies were flowing, people were doing solar, companies were growing, they were continuing to advocate. We began to notice, I think around 2014, 2015, folks started to look at where were those subsidies actually going. And overwhelmingly, we found they were going to middle class or upper middle class, wealthy, sometimes single family homes in the suburbs. Now, there's a lot of reasons for why that's true. It was the easiest to install solar there. You didn't have to negotiate. I live in a triple decker, right? 3 people in the same house. You got to negotiate with all of those people. If you need to cut down a tree, then you need to negotiate with a neighbor. So there were lots of things that made it harder to do in the city, right? And there were lots of things that made it harder to do for those of us who don't live in single family homes. But overwhelmingly, the money starts flowing, and it's flowing to those, quite frankly, who need it the least often. And suddenly then our legislators start going, oh, I don't know if we want to spend so much. I think we've done enough to stimulate this industry. And this was just at the same time that my church was trying to figure out how we could move forward a solar project. And we were trying to figure out just how to get solar on the church. And this was when I was still at my parents' congregation, Bethel AME. We're trying to figure it out. Turns out there's another congregation, it's also in the city, but in a slightly different neighborhood, trying to figure out how can we put solar on our church. And so slowly these churches began to come together with a vision, not just of putting solar on our own congregations, but the reality is that we had these huge roofs, and those roofs were large enough that we could supply power, not just to ourselves, but our energy-strapped, low-income neighborhoods surrounding the church communities. And so we started to put together a vision of what might be possible if we could fill those roofs with solar. And instead of just making it be about the church, it actually could be considered a shared solar project that would give energy at a discounted price to our surrounding neighbors. Basically, we would have had these credits and we could have distributed those credits. What ends up happening is churches start coming together, we get excited, we start reaching out to other folks, and in the midst, our legislature passes a bill that then restricts the availability of those subsidies to shared solar projects. They classified shared solar projects pretty much similar as they did to commercial solar projects. And we stood up and said, this is not fair, you're not looking at this, you're not thinking about how this, but it passed anyway. Suddenly our project went from being financially viable to being financially untenable. Many of the congregations who had been in our conversation before that bill, but did not have a lot of money, were excited, but they said, we can't do this, because we had to go then and raise money, additional funds to put solar, just enough solar to cover the needs of the church, not even enough solar to be able to do a shared solar project for folks around us. And so we ended up, the 3 of us getting together, we put together a bill called Solar Access for All, and it was killed by a climate champion in our legislature, state senator, who says, well, he says it pretty probably, like Senator Barrett, that we shouldn't pay attention to race, we should only pay attention to class, because that's the more fair way. And so because our bill paid attention to class and race, it was killed. And so now solar subsidies, of which there are much less, are much harder to get for folks who are trying to do shared solar projects that would benefit not just nonprofits or institutions or middle-class people, but that also would have the important benefit of having additional subsidies available for those who are actually energy strapped. And so we're still fighting for equitable distribution, but this is an example of where, to be honest with you, I saw so many, even people of faith, line up behind some of the things that he did without holding him accountable for the fact that our climate policy should not be race neutral, because our environmental injustices are not race neutral. So our environmental justice work cannot be race neutral. And so we continue to work on that bill, continue to work on how other ways to bring solar to us. But I want to name the way that these things show up, not just in generalized policies elsewhere, not just in the South, but right up here in the very blue Northeast, where we also struggle to make sure that climate justice is a reality. And then I want to share another quick story that I think is an example of some place where it went well and continues to go so. I had the opportunity about 5 years ago to be in Chicago visiting with some congregations that were doing some pretty exciting work there as part of Green the Church, and got to hear about the work being done at Faith and Place. Faith and Place is a faith-based group that works across the state of Illinois and does quite a bit of work also at the State House. So they told me the story of the Illinois energy efficiency legislation. Like in many states, it started off exactly as you would suspect, energy efficiency being promoted by the folks who are consumer advocates as a way to reduce the cost for all folks who are using energy. It got quickly exciting for a lot of the environmentalists, so they definitely jumped on the boat. And so you had the consumer advocates and the environmentalists working together. That would have been great. Probably could have moved the needle in a pretty significant way. But they made a pretty critical decision that I thought was really exciting, and from my perspective, made the bill not just about climate change, but climate justice. They made a decision that in order to do the home energy audits that would be required across the state to really accelerate energy efficiency, they needed to train a new workforce of folks that were able to go out and do those audits in homes. And they decided that the group they should tackle and train and support to do that work were young people aging out of foster care. For those of you who may not have done work around criminal justice reform or not with young people, you may not know that the number one indicator of whether or not a young person will end up in prison is two things: whether or not they have a parent or family member that's been in prison, and whether or not they've been in foster care. Unfortunately, when the state intervenes in theory to protect our children, it often can lead to worse outcomes than we would otherwise expect. And what we find is that a lot of times young people in foster care, when they age out, do not have the support system around them to figure out what they need to do next. And so that is why they often end up engaged in some behaviors that make them, that send them on their way to prison. And so a lot of folks felt like if we come together and train these young people, we are actually putting them on a career path that actually helps them to move in the opposite direction of prison, but really on something that would help them to be able to care for and grow families of their own. In making that decision, suddenly you had a bunch of child advocates up there at the State House advocating for an energy efficiency bill. And on top of that, criminal justice reform advocates, formerly incarcerated people who were standing up and saying, this kind of pathway, had it been available to me, maybe my life would have turned out slightly differently. Imagine what it was like for legislators to see a very non-traditional group of allies coming to them and saying, we want you to put significant dollars behind this because we see it as an opportunity to address energy costs, climate emissions, the needs of young people, and criminal justice reform. Why don't we do that more? Why are we not thinking more in the same way that Jesus did? That it's always better to be welcoming more people in. That we want to start our thinking with those at the margins and figure out how we actually tackle systems by bringing in those folks who those systems have often left out. I remember being so inspired by that. And it is part of, and particularly the role of the faith community, that it may have been part of what led me to the thing that I probably am most excited about in government, which is a program called Power Corps. I don't have a lot of time to talk about it, but I hope you'll look it up. Power Corps started in Philadelphia, and now we're replicating it in Boston. But I can't tell you how much it lifts my soul to be able to go out and see young, Black and brown men and women out in the field, in my local community, pulling invasive species, learning to prune trees, and being able to train for the kinds of green jobs that are growing rapidly across this country, but far too often are excluding the very communities that are living at the intersection of environmental injustice and economic decline. We have a real opportunity to advocate for and build the kind of powerful solutions that don't just address one issue, but bring multiple issues together and lift up the very folks that Jesus prioritized. So I will pause there. I look forward to more conversation, and I want to just share my thanks in advance for Pastor Deb, who invited me out when she was in Flint, and who has been doing amazing work, and I can't wait to hear what you have to share, Pastor Deb.
Thanks so much, Reverend Mariama. It's always a joy to hear you and to be inspired of the way you connect all those intersectional dots and inspire us to do the same. So, Pastor Deb, your turn.
So my entire reason for being here is to tell you a story. So here we go. In April 2014, the city water source for Flint, Michigan was switched from Lake Huron, managed by Detroit, to the Flint River, managed by the city of Flint. This was to save money, said the folks in charge, who did not think things through very well. The Flint water treatment plant had not been used in years and was not prepared for the corrosive Flint River. Not enough staff members, not enough of the right kind of engineers. So water not properly treated for corrosion was released into pipes made of lead. If you've ever looked inside a water pipe, maybe you notice the coating in there that's kind of gross. This is biofilm, the buildup that for a long time had protected the people of Flint from the lead pipes. But corrosive water damaged the biofilm and then began leaching the lead into the water that was delivered into people's homes. The treatment for corrosive water and damaged biofilm is to recreate the biofilm, which is done with additives in the water at the treatment plant. But with the treatment plant understaffed and engineers who could not properly monitor, the additives were never just right. When they were too low, corrosion damaged the pipes. When they were too high or water did not move efficiently through the pipes, then folks consumed bacteria and other healthy stuff that grew in the water. So the people of Flint had a dual threat: lead poisoning and or infectious disease, including pneumonia and Legionnaire's disease, which killed a dozen people. But I want to back up for just a minute and talk about democracy, itself created as a racist system, as we know. Specifically in Michigan, there was a law that in any city struggling financially, the governor could set aside the elected leaders of that city and appoint an emergency manager to set things right. Michigan voters did not like the law and voted to repeal it. The legislature passed it again, but this time with a budget. Laws with budgets could not be repealed, so the law stood. That law has been activated in virtually every Black city and town in Michigan. I read that as many as 70% of Black Michiganders have lived under an emergency manager at some point, compared to barely 2% of white residents. So in Flint, a majority Black city with substantial Middle Eastern and Hispanic populations, Michigan's white Republican governor dismantled democracy and appointed someone to take charge. Then within Flint, while the whole city was affected, as so often before, the majority Black neighborhoods felt a disparate impact because of the effects of prior racism and capitalism plus tax policy. Like this: when the auto industry began moving to non-union states, tens of thousands of workers lost their jobs, which meant they lost their homes. And because the auto industry was the catalyst for the entire city economy, other jobs disappeared too, and homes became nearly worthless. With no jobs in the community, there were no buyers for homes. Flint went from a city of 200,000 residents to just 80,000 residents over about 30 years, and General Motors jobs dropped from 100,000 to fewer than 6,000. With greater generational economic stability and resource, as is typical, white people fared better and very many moved away. Remaining in the city then were the least economically resourced, who were overwhelmingly Black. Whole neighborhoods were emptied, some virtually overnight. In Flint now, there are more blighted neighborhoods than intact neighborhoods, and Flint residents of color disproportionately live in the midst of blight and disrepair. This matters in understanding the water crisis because all those empty houses in formerly robust neighborhoods had no active water service. A city built for 200,000, now pumping water for 200,000 was now serving just 80 to 90,000. Corrosive water sat and stagnated or moved far too slowly, and the pipes took a beating. This was personal for me. In February of 2014, I was called to serve People's Church of Flint, which was then known as Woodside Church, a congregation, of course, of the ABC, UCC, and Alliance. This was 2 months before the water source switch, but the congregation was already dealing with water issues: high costs, low accessibility, dubious safety. We were fighting against privatizing the water supply, which in so many cities has caused prices to go up and service to become unreliable or punitive. In a city with water prices among the highest in the country, we were also advocating for free water, for the minimal amount of water the World Health Organization says is necessary for life, 50 to 100 liters per person per day. We had a water committee. We studied, we invited city officials, some of whom would later be indicted, to meet with our leadership. And we held community meetings in which people showed up with gallon jugs of brown and yellow water from their taps with water bills in the thousands. And that was before we knew there was a lead issue. In the midst of all that, I was buying a house in the city. I learned that the deposit required to turn on water service in a new place was $50 for folks who own their homes. But for people who rent, it was $450. Now, Flint has a poverty rate of about 40%, with unemployment at that time of better than 25%. Mortgages were hard to get, and that's another racist saga for another day. So there were a lot of renters, as there are in nearly every community of color. And with few jobs and high poverty, evictions became a constant threat, which meant paying for a new water connection every damn time. More racism, penalizing renters who were disproportionately people of color. I stayed in Flint and served People's Church for 8 years until May of this year. I and my cats actively, unknowingly consumed poison water officially for 18 months. Then, startled by home test results way above EPA guidelines, I chose to switch to a water delivery service. That cost was on top of the cost of city water, for which we were still required to pay. My city water bill was about $100 a month. People who refused to pay their bills risked having their water shut off, their homes condemned, their children removed, because of negligence and whatnot, plus eviction if they rented. It was an ugly cascade. Additionally, I did not have to worry about eviction, but additionally, to the other effects, I did have to worry about what 18 months consumption had wrought. I had a series of weird health issues, including pneumonia and a detached retina. I began to experience changes in my ability to focus and to remember. My water heater had to be replaced. My basement was damaged by the workers who replaced the pipes. My beloved cat Beckett died of what the vet suspected was brain cancer, and his brother Ali has had a chronic cough for all these years since. And I was among the least affected by the whole event. So it was personal, but it was also political, as in the way we order our common life for the common good. General Motors noticed right away that the water was corroding the car parts. They quit using it. But that was not enough to convince the city or state officials that something was amiss. One newspaper columnist wrote that he was tired of Flint's whining, always something with those people. Michigan Public Radio refused to pay attention to the complaints and cries of the people until very much later. Said one state official, "It's called the Safe Drinking Water Act, not the Tasty Drinking Water Act." Another wrote in an email, "Flint's not the kind of place you want to go out on a limb for." President Obama came to town and chided us. "We all consumed lead when we were kids and we didn't die," he said. But a lot of us did die, right? Then he took a sip of water on television, which, because I was in the front row that day, I knew was not Flint water. State and city officials said the water was safe, but they would not drink it. Law enforcement got involved, which is always a good thing, hoping to be seen as the good guys. Police and National Guard began going door to door, handing out filters, but in some cases that became cover for serving warrants or arresting occupants. People became afraid to answer the door, so they got no new filters, no new information. Flint's Spanish-speaking population was especially reluctant to open the doors. Flint is just 70 miles from the Canadian border, and ICE and Border Patrol were constantly visible in the city streets. People were terrified all the time. Public information was initially not translated into Spanish until activists challenged that at a meeting with the lieutenant governor. As recently as this spring, 2022, when I left Flint, community partners were telling me there were still Spanish-speaking people who did not know about the water problem. We protested all the time, starting in 2014. Now, you may remember in the early months of COVID that white supremacists stormed the Michigan Capitol armed to the teeth, ostensibly to protest rules about masks and lockdowns. They were allowed to fill the rotunda and the gallery, still carrying their assault weapons. But when our group of mostly Black, peaceful, and unarmed protesters entered the Capitol to protest the water, we were made to leave even our protest signs and banners outdoors. The state set up a registry so that folks could sign up, presumably for the additional services we would need over a lifetime. But the registry asked a whole lot of invasive questions about pre-existing health conditions, and I began to suspect it would be used to exclude rather than include vulnerable people. So I did not sign up. You can call me a conspiracy theorist, but my state government poisoned my water. In Flint, it is very hard to find anyone who freely trusts anymore. So all these years later, we're still waiting for resolution. Charges were filed, then dropped, cases dismissed, then filed again, then dropped again. The latest indictments were thrown out by the Michigan Supreme Court just this summer. No one has been held criminally accountable. Lawsuits were filed and thrown out, and then filed and allowed to go on. Finally, last year, I guess, headlines announced the $626 million settlement, calling it historic, massive, and using other words to suggest something really big. But I did some math, so bear with me here. Potentially 90,000 people of Flint got $626 million for years of poisoned water. After attorneys take a third, and you divide it up, that's about $4,900 each on average, but we know most folks will get way less. By contrast, though I would not begin to compare, I'm not comparing crimes, but by contrast, in the settlement of sexual assault victims against Michigan State University and the gymnastics Dr. Larry Nassar, 332 victims will average $500,000 each. In the recent case of sexual assault by a Manhattan gynecologist, Columbia University will pay a settlement averaging just over $700,000 to each of 226 victims. And Alex Jones of InfoWars said a court must pay nearly $1 billion to 15 Sandy Hook parents, an average of $43 million each after attorney's fees. I'm not saying they don't deserve it, that those crimes aren't heinous, that victims of sexual assault or hard right, soulless harassment don't deserve every penny. But I am certain that 90,000 mostly Black and overwhelmingly poor victims of the trauma of a massive poisoning, which irreparably harm children's futures, cause miscarriages, kill some people, cost a lot of people a lot of time, money, anxiety, and mental trauma and distress, and left so many people uncertain what the future may bring, I am certain that they deserve more than $4,900, which most will surely never see. Hell, just my out-of-pocket costs over the course of the crisis came to maybe twice that. It is always and forever about race, about resources based on race, about a system that cares or fails to care, that assigns credibility or refuses to assign credibility based on race. Nevertheless, I signed up for that settlement just to try to see this thing through to the end. So to sign up, I had to navigate about 30 pages of legal language, and finally I needed to call my attorney to help me understand my rights and options. Proving harm was nearly impossible, mostly due to inaccessibility of meaningful tests. Who can prove how a hot water heater died? My doctor wanted me to get a hair and nail test, but I could not find one in a two-state area, and neither the doc nor the county or state health departments could help. I had resources, I had insurance. Most folks did not. So in the court battle, activists asked the judge to reject the settlement as insufficient. They especially complained about the judge's expectation that folks would have needed an even more hard to access bone test done to establish harm. The nearest testing sites for that test were in Indiana and New York, at least 400 miles away, requiring transportation, one or more nights lodging, perhaps childcare time away from tenuous jobs, plus the cost of the test itself was $500. The white judge said that $500 is not too much, and Indiana and New York are not too far for people who have so much at stake, and she rejected the objection. So I completed the paperwork, but have no proof of anything except that I lived in Flint those years. We'll see what that brings. Since then, I've accepted a new call to a congregation that wants to live and wants to do justice. My wife and I moved here to Denver. God's Prozac, said my neighbor. Just when I thought I was learning to trust a tap again, which was no small thing, I saw a Denver billboard warning me of lead in the water. I called the water department and had a long conversation. I acquired a test kit, which is still pending. I learned that Denver lead and water issues came to light about 10 years ago, and the water authorities in Denver, Aurora, and elsewhere have fought in court against having to employ proper remediation measures. Finally, though, pipes are being replaced, a process that will likely take another 15 years. The remaining issues, according to my newcomer knowledge of the city, are mostly in zip codes with high numbers of Black residents. So it's still about race. It's about neighborhoods that are blighted, which older homes are neglected by landlords or resource-strapped owners. It's about which people we believe when they tell us what they experience. It's about who gets to go first when a problem is suspected and needs to be fixed. It is about race. It's about Jackson, the capital of Mississippi, which is 83% Black. After storms left residents for 50 days without drinking water, the white Republican governor made the lighthearted comment at an event in Hattiesburg last week that it is, as always, a great day not to be in Jackson. I guess Jackson is not a place you want to go out on a limb for. It's about Puerto Rico under massive devastation from storms and tossed a roll of paper towels by our demented toddler of a former president. It's about New Orleans pillaged by white developers after Katrina did its worst, failed by the Bush administration, which seemed not much to care, and the former First Lady Barbara Bush commenting on the thousands of people sheltering in the Astrodome in Houston. So many of the people in the arena here, you know, were underprivileged anyway, so this is working very well for them, she said. But it's oddly also about Tommy Tuberville, football coach turned senator, who made the statement last week that criminals don't deserve reparations because people of color who have been harmed are so often vilified for seeking wholeness. It's about all that, and it's not over, not in Denver, not in Flint, not really anywhere. I got a call 2 weeks ago from someone in Flint asking to set up yet another water distribution station at my old church. Of course, I referred them to somebody who's actually there. And cities across the country are reckoning with their poisonous or dangerous infrastructure. People are living in danger and private interests continue to extract and exploit, and people of color bear the lion's share of the devastation. So where does that leave us? It is tempting to believe that environment is only the natural environment, but it's much bigger than that. Environment is created by God and it is fashioned by humans. It is earth and air and ocean and lake. It is also housing and roads and bridges and office buildings and schools and hospitals. It is asbestos and lead and plastic and oil and waste from animal CAFOs and whatever else we can dream up to build or pour or drain or spill into the environments that we share. In Flint, the racism was evident in the infrastructure, in water safety and access, in democracy, in paperwork, in settlements, in court demeanor, in lack of accountability for perpetrators, in lack of respect for those who were harmed, and in expectation that the harmed ones would have disposable income and personal resources, though resources have been extracted from communities of color from the moment genocidal explorers arrived and said, "We live here now." We do this to one another, but we don't do it equally. The brunt is borne first by people of color by means of policies and practices that are rooted in racism, which is the backbone of capitalism. We do this to one another. We need to call it what it is and we need to do better. So someone said this week that a socialist is just a neighbor who's got your back. That sounds like a pretty good description of the life of Jesus to me. Environmental injustice is racial injustice. So what does it mean to say we are progressive people of faith? Who do we mean to be, after all?
Thank you, Pastor Deb. Wow. Thank you both for those really powerful testimonies, along with the slides and presentation from Dr. Bullard, kind of laying out the definition. I think anybody who's here today has thoroughly had their dots connected. We now know, some for the first time and some in a much deeper way, how racial justice and climate justice, environmental justice are connected. And we don't have a lot of time left, but let me, we've got maybe 5 minutes, 4 or 5 minutes. The question, after hearing both of you and Dr. Bullard, there is so much outrage, discouragement when you look and when you see when the veil is removed and we really see the way these things are interconnected and the cost they are bringing to communities, all communities, but especially to communities of color and low wealth. I want to ask the two of you just briefly, how do you move through that rage, with that rage, and bring your faith to it in a way that, number one, kind of keeps you sane and grounded and not despairing, and number two, moves you to action? Because I think maybe the answer to that question is the one that folks in our faith communities need to know, if when they're going to get engaged in this work.
If I didn't preach every week, I don't know what I would do with rage. My sermons are not rage filled, but they are a vent. They're an outlet for saying something that matters, that calls people to action, including me when I am complacent. So this is why I have zero patience with preachers who waste their pulpit every week.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, that my congregation really is a place where I feel both a leader, but I also feel held. And I think just the permission to see that it's all connected. Because sometimes I think people try to make you feel like you're crazy, that you're like, oh, you're bringing that up again. And it's like, because it's here again, because it's, it's relevant, right? And so I think for me, being in a space where we can name that, there's a lot of folks in my congregation are activists also. And so for us, it's not just about moving the issues, but also recharging from the reality that it gets rough. If you're serious about justice work, you don't win all the time. And that is the reality of it. And so we both talk about how do we keep pushing, but we also have to be a space. Like, I have a member who did all this work to get legislation that would give driver's license to undocumented people. And now people went and organized to put a ballot initiative to try to take it away. And it's just, the years and years you do to work in justice. And so I think you can't do justice work alone. And I will say the community piece of it is absolutely a necessity to be able to stay in the fight.
I also want to make the point that I am new in my current congregation, and y'all should pray for them, because we're still getting to know each other. We're still learning to understand what drives us each, and building a relationship together. I am blessed every day to be pastor at Parkview Church in Aurora, and I'm looking forward to harnessing the passion that I see in the congregation. So I am very, very proud of this congregation and the path that they want to be on, but we're still new together.
Yeah, I amen to that. I know with our pastor at Old Cambridge Baptist Church, where I'm minister for Earth Justice, Pastor Cody Sanders has preached a lot about this intersection, and we are working to really align the focus for our ministry at the intersection of climate and racial justice. And it's a job, but mainstreaming it into all of the aspects of congregations work, and not just in some silo with some green team somewhere. Not that we don't need green teams, but preaching about it, teaching about it, dealing with the pastoral care issues that go with the climate grief folks, the public policy engagement, the witness out there in the world. All of those things are important. I saw somebody in the chat saying they wanted to, ask, this makes me want to ask more from my ministers, and so, or rabbi, or, whoever your spiritual leader is. If you are a faith leader, go home and speak about this and teach about it and preach about it. If you're a lay person, talk to faith leaders in your communities, get them on board. I'm seeing it's 3 o'clock. We've really not had a chance to. I've answered a few of the questions in the Q&A just online, and I believe I saw a link that folks could get to if they wanted to ask more through Creation Justice in the chat. Helen, do you want to? Did you post that?
I did, but I shared that from one of the people on the panelists.
Okay, so that is one place to get more answers, and it'd be great to spend. It would be great to spend all afternoon with you folks. This has been such a rich and deep and challenging conversation. And in the interest of being true to the folks who have other things and have planned to be off here at 3, we do have to end the webinar, but do let this conversation continue in your local faith communities and beyond. I want to thank everyone again who made this event possible. Our sponsor, the Alliance of Baptists, all our wonderful co-sponsors, all of you who work behind the scenes, including our tech folks and Q&A folks and our interpreters, and especially, of course, our panelists, Dr. Robert Bullard, Reverend Mariama White-Hammond, and Pastor Deb Conrad. And thanks to all of you who showed up today from across the country and around the world. We do hope that today's event has given you the inspiration and information that you need to respond as faith communities to the challenges of environmental racism and economic injustice where you are. Thank you.